Dr. Proctor, welcome to Reason and Theology. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. I was really excited when I got an email saying that you're going to be doing a course on demons
Mhm.
and ghosts in the Bible. I said, okay, yeah, that's definitely a topic I want to explore with you. So,
Yeah.
really honored to have you today.
Mhm.
This is a topic that I think a lot of people are going to be interested in. In fact, I've
Yeah.
done videos on demons, exorcists. I've had exorcists on, and those tend to
Mhm.
be topics that people are really interested in. And so,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
people are going to enjoy this one.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, first of all, why you decided to do this
Mhm.
course before we dive into
Yeah.
the material itself.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my research is on demons and early Christianity. So my first book was about the bodies of demons, how early Christians thought about these bodies of demonic entities and how that played a major role in many really important early Christian texts like Gospel of Mark and early Christian apologists and things like that. So I'd researched it quite a bit, and then in my teaching, I've taught a version of this class, for almost a decade now.
Oh,
And so insights I share with my students about demons in early Christianity, demons in the Bible, related entities like ghosts and fallen angels. So I've been teaching about it for a while now, and thought it'd be fun to kind of take this to a bigger audience. As you say, I know there's interest out there, so it'd be fun to kind of get out of the classroom and share those with other people and see what questions people have. So I'm excited about it.
since you're talking here about demons and ghosts, one thing
Hmm.
that I hear very often is people will say, there's no difference, right? If you've
Mm-hmm.
seen a ghost, it's actually a demon. So it's
Yeah.
not your dead grandmother that you encountered, it's actually a demon portraying them.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the distinctions here, if there are distinctions, and the biblical origins of these things. Can you
Hmm.
maybe walk me through that?
Yeah, so it's classically defined both in biblical and related cultures and even other, ancient cultures too. Of course, we have ideas going back really far in written human history of the ideas that spirits could linger on past their death. So humans who pass away, their spirits might linger on, and we have terms like ghosts used to refer to them. And then we do also have ideas of there being an idea of some kind of evil spirits out there that could haunt people or hurt people, maybe even possess their bodies. And again, kind of related to what you've encountered, we do see people merging those categories. On the other
Mhm.
hand, I think we see many that would want to distinguish them. So, um, as classically defined in biblical texts or related writings, demons are thought to be a ghost of some sort, actually, but a very specific kind of ghost. So, some of our most ancient Jewish storytelling about demons usually identifies them actually as kind of the ghost or lingering spirits of giants or the Nephilim that
Mm.
existed prior to Noah's flood. So this story is famous from Genesis 6. The sons of God and the daughters of men, their union happens. It creates these Nephilim. Unfortunately, Genesis 6 doesn't give us a ton of detail about what's going
Mhm.
on here. It's a pretty short, kind of enigmatic story. But then we do have outside of the Bible some popular ancient Jewish writings, like First Enoch, for example. The portion that I'm thinking of here is called the Book of the Watchers, and it tells a story about, sounds very similar to Genesis 6, but kind of fills in the details more, of fallen angels having a union with mortal women, an erotic union. So they get married to them and they create these gigantic creatures. And that seems to be what the Nephilim are in Genesis 6. And these gigantic creatures wreak all kinds of havoc. It's causing all kinds of trouble on the earth. And that becomes the explanation in First Enoch for why God decides to send a flood to kind of
Mhm.
wipe everything out. And when those giants drowned in the flood, their spirits lived on, and that's the explanation the Book of the Watchers gives for these demons. So, in that sense, demons are a kind of a ghost according to that ancient Jewish storytelling tradition, but a very specific one. But then, side by side, you do have an idea that does show up sometimes in biblical text and other ancient cultures, that there could be kind of more regular ghosts, if you will, that
Mhm.
could be maybe harmful, but also sometimes helpful. And so I think that's where we see a tradition that continues to live on, the idea of ghosts going on. So I think you do have ancient authors who will distinguish, pretty strongly. And I think biblical texts do tend to have a pretty strong distinction between demons and ghosts. But then you do encounter them sometimes where they're kind of merging, or at least maybe they have overlapping ideas, even in the ancient world.
Let's talk a little bit more here about the first Enoch interpretation of
Hmm.
the Nephilim. When I
Hmm.
first read the Bible, that was one thing that really caught my attention.
Yeah,
The,
yeah,
the concept of the Nephilim. Yeah, as you mentioned there, we see them in Genesis 6, and it appears that we also see them come back later after the flood,
Yeah. Hmm.
in Deuteronomy, I believe. And yeah, so I came across different interpretations for that, and let's maybe explore those. So some have interpreted these as fallen angels and the product of fallen angels uniting
Hmm.
with the daughters of men, as Genesis 6 puts it, and then whenever they're destroyed in the flood, as you say, their spirits live on, and
Right.
that's what we call demons today. Um,
Hmm.
I've seen that interpretation. I've also seen others, like Augustine, put forward the
Yeah.
interpretation that
Hmm.
these are actually these are not, disembodied spirits. These are not demons. These are just the
Hmm. Hmm.
daughters of Seth, I think, or Cain, or
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
there's kind of a
Hmm.
commingling between the people of Cain and
Right.
Seth, or
Right.
something along those lines.
Hmm.
And there's just kind of a natural explanation for it. How common were these perspectives in
Yeah. Yeah.
biblical times? It would seem like the Enoch interpretation
Hmm.
would be the more common one. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. And you've mapped out a really important kind of moment in that history with Augustine. I think up until the time, it's always hard to say for sure because we just have, a selection of ancient texts that have come down to us. We wish we had more. It does seem like that Enochic understanding is the one that I think we encounter more, at least in the
Mhm.
first few centuries. When we see an early Christian author interpreting Genesis 6, they're oftentimes, not always, but it seems like they're often influenced by or thinking about those Enochic texts,
Mhm.
or at least ideas related to them as they're interpreting Genesis 6. So, one that I could think of that's really prominent would be like Tertullian of Carthage, who's interpreting, he has some issues he's dealing with in Carthage that he addresses by talking about fallen angels. And when he's speaking of their origins and talking about demons, he appeals to that tradition from Enoch.
Yeah.
It kind of interprets them as being these fallen angel figures that mate with mortal women, and they create these fallen angels and demons. But I think so. I do think that interpretation is the majority one we find up until Augustine, and when Augustine reinterprets that, we see a shift. He's so influential in
Yeah.
church writings. Once
Right.
he reinterprets it and pushes back on that Enochic interpretation, his reading really starts to dominate, and we kind of interestingly see that Enochic influence, really fade out.
Yeah.
Um, so it's an important moment in early Christian demonology slash angelology, where because of Augustine's influence, I think we see an important shift in how those texts are being read.
And I think with that shift, it does seem to depart how the New Testament authors interpreted Genesis 6,
Hmm.
as you're alluding to here.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of Jude, and I think
Hmm.
it's Second
Hmm.
Peter, First Peter, Second Peter
That's right.
1.
Yeah, Second Peter. Yep. Hmm.
And it seems to indicate that these people were, or these beings were, going after strange flesh, and
Yeah, that's right.
there's allusions to something
Mhm.
extraordinary going on there. And it
Mhm.
doesn't really seem that the New Testament authors are thinking of just one group of humans commingling with another group,
Mhm.
one
Yeah.
righteous line with an unrighteous line. It seems like
Right.
they're talking about something sexually disordered,
Hmm.
which would
Hmm.
make sense if you have an angel with a
Hmm.
human. But of course, what many people are going to say is, I mean, how does that even happen? Angels are
Yeah.
disembodied
Right.
spirits. And so I
Right.
don't know
Right.
if there's some kind of, I guess in the Old Testament, we do see sometimes angels manifesting in
Yeah.
some kind
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
bodily form. So I
Hmm.
don't know if that's maybe a solution.
Yeah. It's a great question, and I don't, the ancient texts don't go into the kind of mechanics of it, I guess, or
Right.
physics maybe of it. I wish they did. It made my book a lot easier, I think. But you're right. Yeah, you're right to point out that including in some New Testament texts, we have these allusions to Enochic or Enochic related texts.
Hmm.
And here it's important to note that scriptures of ancient Judaism of the time and early Christianity are kind of in flux. We have important texts, of course, that seem to have a lot of authority, but Christians are still working out like what is their Bible. And
Yeah.
Tertullian's a great example of that, where he actually seems to think that Enoch should in some way be in the Bible.
Right.
But then we see allusions too, or at least it seems like some authors are open to it. So you're right, Jude, and I think it's First Peter, and then another author I'd point to is Justin Martyr, who, while not citing explicitly, seems to have he has some kind of access to First Enoch or versions of it, and seems to think it's an authoritative text that he can cite. So I think
Yeah.
what I find fascinating about that is it does kind of surprise us that when you read authors in the first, second, and third centuries and they're explaining where
Hmm.
did evil come from, they oftentimes go to the kind of Genesis 6 or the Enochic stories first,
Hmm.
rather than maybe Adam and Eve, which I think is our more like kind of our instinct when we're explaining like where does evil come from. We go to the
Hmm.
Adam and Eve story and the serpent in the garden. Seems like early Christian authors really, for one reason or another, while they of course had Adam and Eve as part of their scriptures in Genesis at this
Hmm.
point, they still seem to really gravitate towards that fallen angel tradition as their big kind of etiology, explanation for the origins of evil. So, up
Yeah.
until Augustine, that's what fascinates me, is that I think maybe it surprises us a little bit what stories they were really turning to try to explain their world.
Seems like I heard the late Michael Heiser make that point as well. And so, yeah, I think that what you say really rings true in my own studies of the matter,
Yeah,
for whatever that's worth. But you know, and by the way, you mentioned their first Enoch in the canon. What's fascinating is, I've actually recently had an Ethiopian Orthodox on the show, and they
yeah,
hold to in their canon,
right. Hmm.
first Enoch is biblical. I think they have 81 books in their canon,
Yeah,
so
right, right.
there's an
Hmm.
expanded New Testament canon, and Enoch is part
Yeah,
of it. And
yeah,
that in some ways, it's like I could see why they would do that, especially when Jude is explicitly quoting
yeah.
from it.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
but
Yeah,
anyways.
you kind of have
Mhm.
scripture. Yeah, once, and I talk about that with my students when we talk about either Jude or we talk about authoritative early church fathers. When they're kind of citing it as scriptural, what does that mean for early Christian writings? How should we think about
Yeah.
the New Testament or scriptures? But yeah, for me, it just goes to show the kind of, especially early on, that fluidity of scripture,
Oh,
and
very
it
much.
just means that as historians, we kind of have to be willing to think about that when we're thinking about, if we're trying to figure out what was early Christian demonology like. Um, of course, biblical texts are playing important roles, but we might want to think about some other texts that maybe don't show up in our regular
Sure.
Bibles that were exerting quite a bit of influence too.
Yeah, that the New Testament authors were using, and,
Hmm.
and thinking of. So, can you maybe point to some instances in the Old Testament or in New Testament, where there are ghosts,
Hmm.
but not fallen angels, not demons, not that understanding of it?
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah. A couple famous instances where we have this is the story of the Witch of Endor in First
Right.
Samuel. And so we have a consultation with the ghost of Samuel through this, witch figure, a medium who is consulting that with Saul the king, who needs advice on an upcoming battle, and which it's all kind of ironic because Saul has just declared that mediums, witches, magical practitioners have been outlawed, and so
Hmm.
he's kind of breaking his own rules here when he goes, but shows his
Right.
desperation to for the success that. So since Samuel is deceased at this point, he needs to, but he wants to consult with him. He uses this witch too, and it's a great tale for a lot of literary reasons. It sets up a great kind of irony and tension between the two characters, but it does give a window into, even though we don't necessarily have what I would call a kind of official biblical position on ghosts per se, or a theology of ghosts. It is something that more happens by allusion or by sideways reference, and this is one story where we see that, where it's clearly reflecting or thinking about ancient ideas that were very common, which is just that spirits of deceased people could potentially live on.
Mm.
They maybe in special circumstances could re-enter the land of the living or linger there. And this is again something we can trace back to some of our earliest written cultures. Ancient Mesopotamia, we find ghost stories, and interestingly, we find them being explained in ways that are pretty similar to how show up in our modern ghost stories. So
Yeah.
ghosts might linger because a person passes away at a young age, or they experience a violent death, or maybe they're betrayed by a loved one or family member or something. And that's really kind of a fascinating insight into, I don't know, maybe something universal about human experiences or something. But then we do see those ideas, I think, infiltrate into ideas of the Bible. And here it's that if there's a broader idea of ghosts, again, humans from a really early time period, it seems, thought that maybe those deceased spirits could be helpful to them.
Yeah.
And this is what Saul is doing with Samuel here, is using a medium to say, hey, I need this help from somebody that used to help me out here. Um, Another area where, again, we can kind of see the allusions or a sideways reference to it would be in resurrection stories of Jesus here.
Hmm.
Christians, of course, we have our famous resurrection stories in the Gospels, and there we can see, I think many of those stories have as their foundation, or maybe at least they're in reference to what would have been kind of common ghost stories of the day, either in the sense of kind of setting up the literary expectations of this, where we see members of Jesus's followers, like the followers on the road to Emmaus or Mary Magdalene, encountering him and not recognizing him at first.
Yeah.
And I think the idea here is that he's in a different form, maybe in some way, than what he was when he was alive, and therefore he's at first not recognizable. And that's a common storytelling motif we find in ghost stories. The other way we see it is when the gospel writers and early storytellers of this tradition want to make sure to state, well, but this was more than just a ghost story. And that's where we see Jesus really confirming with his disciples that he is in some way kind of, still existing. So
Hmm.
when he shows them his hands and his feet, it was sometimes common in ancient ghost storytelling to the idea that ghosts didn't have feet. And that's kind of that old idea of them kind of
Huh.
skimming along the surface or kind of floating as they go. Again, we still see that in modern ghost storytelling.
Huh.
Um, and so by Jesus showing his feet, he kind of confirms like, hey, I still have the same, at least in some way, the same kind of, it's the same me that existed before my death. The other way we see that, the famous, doubting Thomas tradition of
Right.
touching his wounds and touching his flesh. Again, I think part of what's going on there is Jesus and these storytellers confirming that, hey, this is more than just some kind of ghost story. And so I think whenever the ancient readers would have been, hearing these stories, reading these stories, I think other ghost stories of the ancient Mediterranean probably would have been kind of
That would have been in mind.
floating in their
Wow.
mind. And then seeing the Jesus story, they would have probably been thinking about that as they tried to make meaning out of it.
Yeah, I was talking to Dr. Arian just a few weeks ago,
Mhm.
and we were discussing the situation with the doubt traditions in the New
Mhm.
Testament, where even as late as Matthew 28, right before the
Yeah,
Assumption, it says that some of the 11 apostles
yeah,
still doubted.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
mhm,
and this is after, according to the New Testament author, having spent time with him, confirming that
mhm.
it's really him and all that,
Yeah, yeah,
still doubting. And so it's kind of like, why would they still doubt? Well, I think
mhm,
what you're suggesting here is that perhaps um, related to these ghost stories, sometimes they appear in a different form. And so, in other
yeah,
words,
yeah.
Jesus after the resurrection is appearing in slightly different form than before, and maybe that's why they were still doubting it. Is that kind of what you're saying here?
I think so. Yeah, I think that we're supposed to kind of have that in convert, or I think those stories would have been kind of influencing how those were told. The idea that they would mistake him for somebody else, um, and then would have informed one way you could tell something was a ghost instead of a regular person before they're passed away would have been that constitution. I think that is like the physical constitution of their body.
Hmm.
Um, Spirits and ghosts and also demons is something that I write about in my book. They were thought to have like a material substance to them.
Okay.
It's just that it was let's say a thinner stuff
Huh.
than what like our flesh and blood bodies are made out of. And
Okay.
so that's why you could see a ghost and you could maybe even like interact with a ghost. Maybe even a ghost could, I don't know, like knock down a pot in your house or something, or a demon could do that. We have lots of stories of demons knocking things over when they're possessing a house or something. So they could materially, physically interact with the world. But then the common tradition you find with ghosts and even demons sometimes is if you tried to touch them in some way with your hand would, go through them.
Huh.
So it wasn't like the
It's
quite
kind of a
as
fluid thing.
stuff. Yeah. Um, Almost like, and I think it's based on ancient ideas of um, outside of the mortal realm, stuff is made of, well, other stuff. And that's actually kind of the logic we have for things like ancient sacrifices. Like, why would you take an animal or other offerings and burn them? Well, in besides just being like an offering for that god or goddess or what have you, it changed that stuff, the physical flesh and blood of an animal, or say grains, into, well, smoke, into
Yeah.
kind of a different kind of material. And the ancient understanding would be that changed it into stuff that a god could partake of, because the idea
Yeah.
was
The
that gods were
aroma.
made out
Yeah.
of different stuff. And so I think those ideas then get used to think about demons and ghosts. That,
Huh.
hey, they have a material existence, but they exist in a different kind of way. And that's where I think the stories of Jesus' resurrection are trying to figure out, okay, what kind of existence does Jesus have here? A natural maybe interpretation would be that this is Jesus's ghost. And I think some of the stories are maybe some of those earliest stories were told almost like ghost stories. But then we do have in these resurrection stories where Jesus and the writers of these stories are really trying to emphasize, okay, but there's more here
Yeah.
than your normal ghost story. This
He
is
he
this
eats
true
food,
resurrection.
and they touch
Yeah,
him, and
exactly. Yeah,
feel
yeah,
the
yeah.
wounds
No,
and that, right?
mhm. Yeah, and that's a classic kind of affirmation of a more physical existence, I think.
Yeah.
And so combating those, and I think part of what's going on here is that there's some apologetic function here, because of
Hmm.
course what we can expect happen, and we have hints of it in the Gospels and our earliest sources, and by critics of Christianity like Celsus later on.
Yep.
Whenever followers of Jesus start saying, "Hey, I've encountered Jesus," or maybe I had a vision of him, you can expect what Greco-Roman, audiences or other Jews would have responded. They would say, "Okay, you're either making this up, or you just had some kind of hallucination, or you just saw a ghost, and
Hmm.
this wasn't truly Jesus that you encountered." And so I think these stories are then responding to those accusations and saying, "Hey, this is not just an illusion. This is not just an hallucination. Was an encounter with the real Jesus."
Yeah.
So
As
kind of
as well as the
defending
Gnostics too,
Christianity.
right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I think defending in that sense,
Hmm.
this core part of early Christian belief.
I want to ask you about the concept of Satan in the Old
Hmm.
Testament and in the New Testament.
Yeah,
It,
yeah.
it, it appears, and I've seen people say, well, if you just hold to the Old Testament, Satan is seen as more just kind of this adversary in among the divine council, and
Hmm.
he's there to just accuse,
Hmm.
but he's not necessarily this figure that we think of today whenever we
Hmm.
think of the concept of Satan. Can you maybe tell us how was he viewed in the Old Testament and in
Hmm.
the New Testament, all that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most fascinating things about Old Testament, New Testament. It's really interesting to track the development of this figure, Satan. I
Hmm.
think, as you're pointing out, in areas where we might expect to find Satan, we oftentimes don't find him, or
Hmm.
don't find the fully fledged concept of Satan or a devil figure that we might expect. So, one area that many scholars have pointed to, for example, the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, we have the serpent. It's
Sure.
often been read that Satan is there, kind of inside the serpent, and tricking Adam and Eve that way. But that story itself doesn't mention the word Satan or the devil or anything like that, and it could be read just to be referring to this tricky serpent figure.
Hmm.
Um, but then elsewhere, even when we encounter that terminology, as you're pointing out, the Satan, and it's used with that definite article there
Hmm.
in the book of Job, for example. Again, yeah, we find the Satan, that terminology, but it doesn't seem to be like a holy evil devil figure like you
Yeah.
might expect. Instead, he is. I like the way I like to talk about it with my students is that he's kind of like a divine prosecutor.
Hmm.
He's part of God's court, and it's his job to kind of prosecute the case against somebody he thinks might not be quite as good as they look to be. In this
Hmm.
case, Job is the famous example. But that's not necessarily him being evil per se. He's kind of just in the same way that a prosecutor prosecuting a case against somebody who's alleged to do a crime, they're just kind of doing their job.
Hmm.
In the same way, I think the Satan kind of performs that role in the book of Job, at least. But we do start to find in some Old Testament texts hints that there's kind of developing a character named Satan who does seem to be opposing God and or God's people, the ancient Israelites or ancient Jewish followers of God. And we see some hints of this in First Chronicles as well as Zechariah,
Yeah.
where that term Satan is used in a way that's starting to get close to how we end up using it,
Right.
in later Jewish traditions and early Christian traditions. So I think we get hints that as the Bible's taking shape, and maybe as some of the later biblical books are being written, that there is this idea starting to float around that there's a Satan figure who opposes God. I think we definitely find ideas of chief demon evil figures like the devil or Satan in what we would call Second Temple Jewish texts. First Enoch is an example of that. The Book of Jubilees is another. These are popular texts. We find them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example.
Hmm.
And they have these ideas of there's some type of chief demon figure that's opposing God. Interestingly, they don't always use the word Satan. Sometimes they use other names for this figure, whether it's Azazel or other terms like that.
Yeah.
But then we do start to see that term Satan connected with it. And I think by the time we get to the New Testament, within ancient Judaism, that idea is really kind of taken a form that's pretty recognizable to us. We see it with Satan's temptation of Jesus in the desert.
Sure.
He at one point is referred to as Beelzebub when his Jesus' opponents think that he's possessed by some kind of chief devil figure. So by that point, I think we have a pretty strong idea that comes close to the idea of Satan as we have it today, of a chief kind of demon figure opposing God.
Yeah.
Um, I think many scholars would place that in the fact that Second Temple Judaism becomes more apocalyptic.
Mm.
and many it starts to have stronger ideas of a kind of end time scenario where God is going to return, and oftentimes a Messiah is somehow involved in that. And of course, Jesus' followers understand him to be that Messiah. Um, but many scholars point out that apocalyptic ideas are often very dualistic. They have very strong ideas of good versus evil. And that means that you kind of need an evil figure opposing God to kind of make the system work.
Mm.
And so Satan emerges as the way to kind of explain the cosmos. You have God on one side, Yahweh, the Jewish God, and then you have this chief devil figure that comes to be called Satan. So I think that's where most scholars would kind of place the historical origins of Satan and where he really emerges.
Yeah, and certainly by the time you look at the book of Revelation, it's casting
Yeah.
him as
Hmm.
the ancient serpent, going
That's
back
right.
to the
Yep.
garden, or
Yep.
this
Hmm.
dragon and this adversary of God who's being defeated
That's right.
eschatologically. Yeah, so
Hmm.
you certainly see that there. Um, well, I've heard that there's Persian influences
Yeah.
in the
Hmm.
progression of the thought
Right.
here
Right.
between the two testaments.
Right.
Do you
Right.
think that there's some truth to that, and does that account for
Mhm.
perhaps a different emphasis that we see between two testaments?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's a possibility. I think it's always hard. I think it's one of those that's hard to fully substantiate. I don't think there's kind of a smoking gun, so to speak, to show, oh, here's this Persian idea, and then we see it show up here to that
Hmm.
is a certain kind of flow of influence, if you will. But I think it's certainly possible. We know that many Jewish writers and biblical text and related writings are taking shape in part whenever ancient Israelites or Jews are in exile
Yep.
and either living under Persian rule or living near, Persian majority areas. And so I think it's certainly possible that we do have ancient Persian traditions that are quite dualistic and have chief, evil figures. Zoroastrianism is kind of famous for having a kind of good versus evil dualism. And so scholars, I think, for a long time have pointed to that as one potential explanation. I think it's completely possible. I think one other thing I'd point to as kind of an historical context is just the historical reality of Jews living under foreign rule. That for a succession of centuries, starting with the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and Greeks, and then Romans, Jews are living, for the most part, with just a couple exceptions in there, under foreign rule, sometimes in exile. And so it becomes really understandable that they would start to interpret their world as, well, being controlled by evil forces, because really they've been living under foreign rulers that at varying levels have been sometimes pretty permissive of Jewish practice, but sometimes have persecuted the Jewish community quite a bit.
Mm.
And so I think that's the historical circumstance that dualism of good versus evil and that apocalyptic idea of explaining, well, why is the world, why are we not in control of, say, the Holy Land right now? Well, it's because God is kind of waiting until that apocalyptic time. And then that, I think, forms the historical context for maybe why some of those Persian dualistic ideas would have started to really take root in Jewish culture.
You also kind of seem to encounter that ideology with the book of Daniel.
Hmm. Hmm.
Michael
Yeah.
is wrestling against dark
Hmm.
forces. I think it was Michael
Yeah.
or Gabriel. I forget which one.
That's right.
In the
Yeah.
book
Yeah.
of Daniel,
Hmm. Hmm.
wrestling with dark forces there, and that's of course taking place while they're in exile. I
That's
wonder if
right.
there was
Yep.
some influence from Babylonians.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example of where we have this kind of exilic context, which is then shaping how biblical writers are thinking about their world, and then I think absolutely kind of at least lending itself to that more dualistic interpretation of the world, which
Hmm.
then provides the context for why a figure like Satan might help people make sense of what they're experiencing.
Well, Dr. Proctor, I could talk to you for hours, but I know we're out of time here. So I want to encourage all of the viewers to go and check out the link right there in the comment section and show description for the course. Go and purchase it. 28 lessons, May 20th, Demons and Ghosts in the Bible with Dr. Proctor. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was an absolute honor.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/Reason and Theology.